Welcome to Smart Energy, a podcast where we talk about electrification, home improvement, and clean energy. I'm your host, Andrew Zoellner, editor-in-chief at OhmConnect. This week, I'm joined by Kelsey Bourgeois, senior editor at OhmConnect. OhmConnect is on a mission to rally people to change how and when they use electricity, unlocking clean, affordable, and reliable energy. You can learn more and get paid to conserve energy at ohmconnect.com. Thanks for joining me, Kelsey.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm so happy to be here.
So I've got transportation on the brain today, Kelsey, and specifically thinking a lot about EVs.
Absolutely.
Curious, you live in the Midwest. Do you have a car? Do you drive?
It's a good question. I live in Chicago, actually, but I live in an area that is a food desert. So I do have a car. I can't walk for groceries right now, unfortunately, in the neighborhood I live in. So I do have a car. It's very old, and I'm sort of just doing the thing of wearing it into the ground rather than getting a new one quite yet.
So that's very similar to my wife and I. We historically have never purchased a new car. We were a two-car household sort of before the pandemic, COVID. When we both started working from home, we ended up, we did that thing where we have like two cars and one of them is nicer than the other one. And the one that was less nice and needed more work, we eventually just donated that to public radio. We went down to being a one-car family. But then this summer, it was like very clear our other like nicer car needed more work. We were starting to put a lot of money into it to kind of keep it running. And so we started thinking about buying a new car, and that led me down this EV path.
Yes.
Have you done any research into electric vehicles? Have you
driven one?
ridden one?
I have ridden in one. I have not driven one. It's funny, here in the city, there are Ubers that are Teslas. Mm-hmm. It's really strange. And, a few of my friends have EVs, that kind of thing. So, yeah, when I thought maybe 2 years ago I was going to need to replace my car, same thing, it needed a little money. And I thought, should I just go for it? I started to look into it. And frankly, I got a little overwhelmed. I didn't exactly know how to parse through that information. I'm not big into cars. I really only drive it to the grocery store. Otherwise, we live right by a train station. So a lot of the time we just do that. But same thing, we're a single car household. And so if this was going to break, we were going to need something. But yeah, I will say I also was trying to buy in that moment in the car market where you were going to have to wait 8 months for an EV or something, sure, right? Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe now is not the time.
So spoiler alert, I did buy a new car. It's probably been almost a month now, but we purchased an EV.
Amazing. What did you get?
So we got a Volkswagen ID4.
Okay.
And one of the things, even though like supply has caught up quite a bit in the new car market, EVs are still sort of hard to come by in the Twin Cities, except for these Volkswagens. And interestingly, they were initially left off the list of cars that would qualify for the federal rebates through the Inflation Reduction Act. Because,
why is that?
Before the 2023 model year, they were manufactured, I think, either in Mexico or Germany or a combination of both. And in order to qualify for the rebates, there's a percentage you have to hit for both the battery and where the car is assembled.
Got it.
And in 2023, all of the ID4s are now assembled, I want to say in Tennessee, somewhere down south. And so when we were going to look at EVs and specifically the ID4, there were like hundreds of them in stock.
Wow. And right, because people were probably like, I don't want to touch that if I don't get the rebate, but now you do. Amazing.
Yeah. And
how are you liking it?
Well, so like our other car is a 2008 Honda Pilot. And, car technology has come a long way in the last 15 years. We drove a handful of other like new cars, and everyone we got into were like, oh yeah, this is like way better than the Pilot. we had some like very specific things we were looking for. My wife is an artist, and so she goes to craft shows, so we need to be able to fit a bunch of stuff in it.
Right.
Um, I'm anticipating our Honda Pilot is going to bite the dust at some point in the next couple of years. Probably go back to being a one car household, and so I do like haul some sheets of plywood or drywall, materials, and that sort of thing. Um, and so we were looking for something that was like bigger but not too big because we do still live in a city.
Right.
um in order to qualify for these federal rebates, the like purchase price of the car, or maybe the list price of the car, can't be more than $80,000. Spoiler alert,
Okay.
I would never be able to afford an $80,000 car.
Me either. I hear that and
Yeah,
I'm like, oh, couldn't
but
be me.
like the electric pickup trucks that are out there right now are like the Ford like
Oh.
Lightning and Rivian, potentially Tesla's Cybertruck.
And those would be great for you because you do all this DIY stuff at your
Yeah,
house,
they would
right?
be great
So,
for me, except that they're so expensive.
oh, I see.
So yeah, we ended up getting the ID4. The money part of it definitely played in. Volkswagen is doing, I think, like 3.9% financing right now,
Nice.
which
Yeah.
is like nearly half of what I could get through my credit union.
Right.
Interest rates are kind of nuts. Um, but yeah, so I'm I'm very happy with my purchase. I still like can't get over the fact that like I just come home and I plug it in and it's full in the morning and it costs
Oh,
like
it's
$4 basically to fill my
really
car with electricals.
$4.
So last night so we also don't plug it in every night,
Sure.
because my average driving around during the week is like maybe 20 miles.
Right. We both work from home. We
Yeah.
don't have to do much. Yeah.
So it was down to like 15% capacity, which was like a range of like maybe 30 miles. And so
Okay.
I plugged it in when I got home. We've got a level 2 charger. So it charges overnight quickly. We're also on like a specific plan with our utility. So it charges from 11 until it's full, or 7 a.m.
Perfect.
Uh, but yeah,
And I'm assuming listeners know this, but maybe we ought to say that electricity, if you're new here, if you're new at this, electricity is cheaper at night. So charging it at night is the
yeah,
move.
Yeah, it's. I think we don't. It's not technically off peak in Minnesota because I'm not on a
Oh,
off peak plan.
okay.
Um, but yeah, like because there aren't as many people doing things during the middle of the night when they're sleeping, there's less demand for electricity and it tends to be cheaper.
Amazing.
But so I needed 54.5 kilowatt hours of electricity to charge my car,
Uh-huh.
and that equated to like $4.57.
Oh my gosh, Andrew, you're making me really consider this. I'm still, here in the city, gas right now is near $5 a gallon. And so even though I've got a 2009 Honda Fit,
Mm-hmm.
so it's small, it's very fuel efficient for when it was made. I'm still paying $30-$40 every time, I go. So not fabulous.
And then as I was doing more research into EVs, the cars themselves have way fewer moving parts, way fewer maintenance items than
Ah,
a combustion engine. There's like 12 things in an EV that you need to like maintain. Like there's no oil changes.
amazing.
They don't really go through brakes as much. The tires are special, because an EV is so quiet. Uh, they have like special like low
Oh,
noise tires because otherwise
I
like
remember. I
yeah,
remember hearing about this.
yeah,
People have gotten hit with EVs because they at first because they were so quiet,
yeah,
right? We
yeah.
weren't accustomed to like hearing that. Okay, so the tires are what makes the noise now.
Well, the tires actually are manufactured to make less noise, because when you're
Oh,
driving with like regular tires, you'd be like, oh, what's making that noise?
right.
In like a normal car, that noise would be covered up by the engine. So like the tires are a
Ah,
little bit more expensive because they're extra quiet. Um, and then the other part is that an EV weighs significantly more than a combustion engine vehicle.
I
And so
see.
like they also go through tires faster because like they wear faster.
Got it. Okay. So what do they do about the quiet thing though in terms of traffic? Has there been movement on that, making it a little more noisy so people can hear it coming, or what's happening there?
So I don't think there's a federal regulation yet that like cars need to make noise below 20 miles an hour.
Right.
Um, our Volkswagen dealer mentioned, when he like backed the car into the parking space, it had sort of like a Jetsons like sound to it, and he was like, oh, like that's not a sound that the car makes like uh, just from the course of driving. It's like a programmed sound that plays
Right.
when you're like moving at less than 20 miles an hour.
Got it.
Because there are
Cool.
those regulations in Europe, and Volkswagen just like manufactures all their cars the same, regardless
Right.
of whether or not that's needed in the U.S.
Right.
Um,
Well, that's great. I mean, you can feel a little safer driving around, right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
my neighborhood is really bad that way. So I think about it a lot. We've had to put in roundabouts and speed bumps. People drive really, really fast here. It's really scary.
um, so a couple of EV things in the news this week. The big one is the Inflation Reduction Act is offering, I think, $7,500 for qualifying EVs. I don't. There's not like an income component to that, but there's a cost for the base price of the EV, so they're not like luxury EVs, even though like any
Right.
entry level car going from 2008 to now feels luxurious.
Yes.
But then states are also offering incentives for folks to purchase EVs. In Minnesota, I think it's going to be up to $2,500 depending on income
Nice.
for an rebate for an EV. But Colorado is doing a Cash for Clunkers program.
Oh,
Do you remember when the federal government did this in like, I want to say like 2009, like during the recession?
yes, vaguely. I was, pretty young at that time, but the thing that comes to my mind is cars for kids, but that's not the same thing.
Sure, but I just love that I love the name
These are
Cash for
clunkers.
Clunkers.
Me too. Me too. I want cash for my clunker. I'll
So
do it.
in Colorado, this program is specifically for folks making 80% or less of the median income in their county, and they
Great.
can get up to $6,000 if they replace their current vehicle with an EV.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
$6,000 is like a solid down payment. You could really do it at
yeah,
that point. Yeah.
and up to I think $4,000 if they're not buying a new EV, but they're buying a used EV.
Used it. Great. I love that program.
Yeah, and so that's the other thing is like the getting like the adoption rate of EVs has been like sort of a trickle for the last 10 years. I don't know when the first like Tesla came out, but I want to say it was 2015,
It's been a
2014,
minute. Yeah.
almost 10 years. And but especially with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's been a huge uptick in the amount of EVs sold. So our guest today is Max Dunn, one of our coworkers who's an EV enthusiast. But he mentioned a story he read. I think maybe like 25% of our all new cars in California in the last year sold were EVs, which is like a huge
Wow.
number. So it
That
sort of feels
is.
like we're at this tipping point.
I
Um,
think that's right. I'm seeing them pop up in Chicago too. Like I said, I'm getting Uber drivers with Teslas or various EVs. So it's common. It's common here. Yeah.
Um, the other transportation story I saw this week is that there is now officially a competitor to Amtrak in the United States.
Really? Who is this competitor?
So the company is called Brightline,
Okay.
and they are opening a route between Orlando and Miami.
Okay.
Um, I've never made that drive,
Neither.
but and the really interesting thing is that it's like it's a privately funded company. I think there may be like some federal incentives, but like
Sure.
as we know in the United States, like Amtrak is like like a semi-private company. Like it's heavily subsidized by the
I
federal
think that's
government.
right. Yeah.
But there historically have been like no competitors because of that.
Right.
So
Right.
Brightline is opening this route between Orlando and Miami, and then their next sort of like plan is to do one between Las Vegas and Southern California.
Oh, that'd be so popular. Whenever you travel or hear about anyone in any other country and they're like, oh, yeah, just take the 45-minute train. It's like, oh, man, if only. So I love to hear that that's happening more and more here.
And you mentioned being close to the train in Chicago. Are you mostly just like taking the L like to other parts in the city?
Exactly. Yeah. One of my partner's jobs is downtown, and so we're. I mean, I can see the train out my front window right now. We're actually sandwiched in between the L and the Metra, which is the train that goes all the way to the suburbs.
Sure.
So the kids in the neighborhood are big train enthusiasts, which is very cute. But yeah, we've got the L, which is around us; it's above ground, and then the Metra. So yeah, we take the L, anywhere that we can. But if you're doing a big grocery shop, it's a little tough. We could do it, but there's not a stop at the closest grocery store. So again, living in a food desert, I did not know what that would be like until I was here. Living in a city for 7 years, I've always been able to walk to get groceries. And it's been such an adjustment. And, realizing I have all these neighbors who, don't have cars, and there's a tower of elderly people, like a retirement home nearby, and they don't have anywhere they can walk for groceries. So, I told you there's a few urban farms on my on my block, so that's been a big help. But yeah,
Transportation is important.
it's huge.
In my neighborhood, we live maybe 5 blocks from the co-op.
Oh, nice.
But like still, miles from like the nearest like large grocery store.
Right. Right.
And I would love to be able to do all of my shopping at the co-op. But again, like there's an expense associated with
It's
that.
so expensive. Yes.
So unfortunately we do still need to have a car. And there is something about that like relative freedom of being able to be like, I'm going to go to this place and I don't need to look at a bus schedule or a train schedule, and I can be there as long as I want to or don't want to.
And then head home. No, I'm totally with you. I drive a lot of places. I'm not a big drinker, so lots of times when we go out too, I drive because I want to be able to leave when I want to leave. But and I would say, Chicago's a pretty good public transit city. It's not amazing, but it's pretty good, and still a lot of the people I know drive. So
it was. So I moved to Minneapolis as a college student, and then have made a lot of friends that have like grown up in Minneapolis in the suburbs. And like as a college student, I got my bus pass, subsidized bus pass, took the bus everywhere.
Yep.
The light rail showed up, kind of early in my college experience, and the light rail at that time ran from downtown Minneapolis to the Mall of America and the airport.
Yeah, sure.
But like talking to my friends who sort of grew up in the suburbs here in the Twin Cities, they were like, oh, I've never ridden the bus. Like the bus is dangerous.
Oh my gosh, the bus is dangerous. So if you haven't caught on, I live in a neighborhood that, people have a lot of feelings about who don't live here about the danger of it. And we won't get into the details of it, but I think that's right. I think a lot of people of a certain, if you have a certain amount of privilege, you have a certain amount of money, you might sort of be like, oh, I'm scared of public transit. And it was an adjustment for me. I'm from a small town where I never took the bus, mid-sized city, but small compared to Chicago. And coming here, I definitely had the adjustment of, okay, how do you do public transit? What's the deal? And then you get the hang of it pretty quickly and you realize everything's fine. Chill out, don't wear your headphones. You're going to be fine.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm very excited to talk to our guest today, who is Max Dunn. He is the chief software architect at Home Connect. We don't talk about software really at all. He's an electric car enthusiast and was a pretty early adopter. Cool. So it was a fascinating conversation. And Kelsey, I'll check back with you after I talk to Max. Today, our guest is Max Dunn, Chief Software Architect at OhmConnect. He's also an electric vehicle enthusiast, and that's really the topic of our conversation today. Thanks for joining me, Max.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me.
I'd like to just kind of dive right in and learn more about how you got interested in electric cars, electric vehicles.
Sure. Yeah. My interest in electric vehicles goes way back. And really, it started when I was at the airport looking for a book to read on the airplane and picked up a book called The Long Emergency by Howard Kunstler. And in this book, it talks about peak oil and how we've got a finite amount of fossil fuels, and sooner or later, we're not going to be able to extract them out of the ground as fast as we need them. And he had a pretty dire prediction of this peak oil happening so rapidly that we wouldn't have the fossil fuel energy in order to make renewable energy, things like solar cells and wind turbines. So he really saw us going back and living the way we did a couple hundred years ago with, very little technology and fossil fuels. Well, of course, that didn't come to pass, but it really made me start thinking about the fact that fossil fuels are limited. We are going to run out sometime. And it's also a bad energy source. It's dirty, and there's just much better ways of being able to power civilization. So the main thing I got involved in is electrifying transportation. It was one of the things that seemed to be the most easily reachable and practical. So yeah, I got started years ago with electric bicycles, had a couple of those. I had an electric Vespa scooter, electric motorcycle. My first vehicle I had was a converted Volvo that they had put these lead acid batteries in. And on a good day, I got 17 miles of range out of it, maybe push it to 20 sometimes. Not super practical, but it really was before we had any real production vehicles. So then I got a Leaf, and now I have a Tesla.
And what year were you driving this electric Volvo?
Oh, that's a good question. I always think about how old my kids were when I did that. So that must have been around 2010. So it was probably, a good 13 years ago.
Oh, so did you do this conversion yourself, or did you just happen upon someone who'd done it? And I'm really curious about this Volvo.
Yeah, so it was really interesting because they had taken a new Volvo and stripped out the engine and made it an electric vehicle. And this was done in someplace in Texas. And it's tricky doing that because in old style gas cars, they have fan belts to run compressors and vacuum pumps for the brakes and all these things that had to be then simulate or run other ways through this electric motor. And so it was very clunky. It was like when you got to a stop sign, the power steering didn't work anymore, so it's hard to turn. The air conditioning would kick out. And so it was not really very practical. And, so now, of course, electric vehicles and actually all cars are pretty much electric driven where, any of the power steering or brakes or anything, instead of using those things from the gasoline engine, they use them through electric motors, which is much more efficient.
So thinking about 2010 and then thinking about today, electric vehicles have come a long way. There's a lot more on the market. What are sort of some of the things you've witnessed in the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things is just the range of electric vehicles. When I was doing my conversion Volvo, that's just not practical for anyone, except a hobbyist like myself. And so I was really excited when the Nissan Leaf came out and got one of the first ones. And that had about a 75-mile range. Now, 75 miles is a pretty average range. If you drove on a test track going 35 miles an hour and holding your breath the whole way, you could get 130, that was the maximum.
Sure.
But if you're on the freeway going 75 or 80, you might get 50 miles. So it was really limited. And, but for a lot of people just driving around town, doing their errands, 35 miles is for 90% of the trips, all you really need, all people really use. So, it's really fine for that. But I couldn't drive from where I lived in San Jose up to San Francisco and back, it was 50 miles.
Hmm.
Or if I did, I had to like charge up there. And so it was always a little tricky, especially back then, there weren't a lot of chargers. But then they started increasing, and now my Tesla has a range of 300 some miles, 270, something like that. So I drive to Tahoe and charge once. So
Hmm.
that's been the big thing, is just that electrical vehicles, the range has become enough that you can have it as your only car, and you can take it on long trips in a very practical way.
So do you only have electric vehicles in your household?
So my roommate has a BMW convertible, and it
Okay.
was really funny. I drove it the other day, and I told him like, "Oh wow, this was like going back in time. You had a key and you had to start it,
Hmm.
and I had to shift gears. It's like driving a relic." Uh, so it's a really weird experience doing that. But yeah, like my partner has an electric vehicle, and I definitely encourage all my friends to have them. And it's interesting because even people that don't have a interest in electric vehicles, when they drive it, they're hooked. The fact
Hmm.
that you just get in, it's silent, you step on the accelerator, it goes, you step on the brake, it stops. It's just a great driving experience. So I think a lot of people are getting hooked on them, not because of any altruism or wanting to do good for the planet, but just it's a better experience.
Well, and do so. I'm working on an article about EVs, and actually, I just purchased my first one a few weeks ago.
Congratulations.
And thank you. But it's interesting going back. Like some of the first cars were actually electric vehicles. Like this technology has been around a very long time, and it really feels like batteries are the thing that was holding them back.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you look at that whole story of the original electric cars and going to gas, there's definitely other things going on besides just technology, like a lot of things. The
Yeah.
best technology does not always win. Um, but it's been an interesting journey for the electric vehicles. And one of the things, speaking of politics, that really kickstarted the technology was, back in the early 2000s, I believe, where California had the mandate that by a certain year, a certain percentage of vehicles had to be electric. That really shook up the industry, and
Hmm.
the all the automotive manufacturers started trying to do these hybrid vehicles, and there was a whole thing about who killed the electric vehicle, where GM brought theirs out, and
Yeah.
then it was very suspicious that the person that rescinded the requirement to go electric then went to go work for a gasoline car company. So, lots of interesting things going there. But what happened from that is that the automotive manufacturers had to develop the technology to do these things we talked about, which is to have electric steering, electric powered brakes, air conditioner, and have the whole car be able to work when the gasoline motor was off. And that technology was led us to today, where we now can really have practical electric vehicles.
So my wife and I just bought. So this is our first new car we've ever purchased. I
Wow. Okay.
feel very good that we didn't buy a combustion engine vehicle, but we purchased a Volkswagen ID4, and got a
Ah, heard good things about that.
yeah, we got a pretty killer deal because there are a lot of them right now on dealer lots because they were initially
Mm,
left off the federal rebate list in the Inflation Reduction Act because prior to
mm,
2023 they were manufactured outside the states, but now I think they're made in Tennessee, and they got added on
mm,
sometime this spring. But so we do a lot of hauling. Like my hobbies all include like 4x8 sheets of plywood and drywall. My wife is an artist and does art shows, and so like when we started thinking about we needed a new car, and we were looking at SUVs, and there are some plug-in hybrids, which we drove a few of those, and the benefit is that you get 30 to 40 miles of pure electric range, which is enough for your everyday trips, but you have gas there when you need to drive longer. Um, but there really wasn't anything in the like pure electric, relatively affordable and like sizable. But then I discovered this ID4, and it's definitely like the size of, you know, a compact SUV. It's got plenty of interior space. And it like, even though we've only had it for 2 weeks, we still have our Honda Pilot. When I have to drive the Pilot, it does feel like going back in time, you know, like like we have the regenerative braking on our EV. And so like when you take your foot off the gas, the car will slow down because it's regenerating. And then I started, you know, you get in the gas powered car and you do that and you're like, oh, I'm coasting. Like, and I forgot that's what happens, you know? So because you've had a lot of experience with electric vehicles, you know, I'm curious, have you driven them a lot in the cold or in the snow in Tahoe, that sort of thing?
I have not. I'm a California born and bred, and so I go to the snow for a few days in Tahoe, and it's fun. And never want to live in the snow, though. We have to shovel and put up with it all year. So, and that is certainly a consideration. The Leaf, for instance, has just air-cooled batteries. They don't really have thermal management, which is a problem on both ends of the temperature scale. So if you're driving in Arizona on a really hot day, you actually get really good range. It kind of maximizes the output of the battery at a detriment to the battery life. And a lot of those batteries failed early. Then, of course, you get into the cold and your range goes down. And I actually, my Leaf, there was a warranty on the battery. And so just before 50,000 miles, the range had dropped enough that I got a free battery replacement, which was great. So, the range had been going down, and I got it, went up again, and then it started going down. And at that time, I lived in Campbell and would drive over the Santa Cruz Mountains to go surfing in Santa Cruz. And the round trip was just almost exactly 70 miles. And so if I drove, fairly conservatively, I could make it just fine. But in the wintertime, because it was just that much colder, there were times when I got home and I had like 1 mile left. There's one time I had 1 mile left or 2 miles left. And so even with California cold, which is not like in the really cold territories, it makes a difference. And it's something you have to look out for.
So in Minneapolis, where I live, it does get very, very cold. We do have a garage, but it's also full of my hobbies, which is mostly tools and wood. So this car will be parked outside year round. And so that, I think that's going to be one of the interesting things to look at. But also, like, when it's cold or super snowy, we don't really want to go anywhere anyway. So, like,
that's a good point, right?
Yeah. But one of the things I'm actually like really, really excited about. So remote starters are like a huge thing in Minnesota. It gets super cold. So like you start your car 15 minutes early from the warmth of your house and you get into it and it's nice and warm. I've never had one. I think that's how they work. But with the climate control and in an EV, both, you can pre-cool it and preheat it. And like, I'm very excited about that. Preheating in the winter.
It makes a big difference. Like, here in California, when it gets real hot, I'm sure Minnesota the same way in the summertime, you get in the car and it can be hot. So by having it cool down a little bit, it makes it very comfortable. The other thing too is almost all cars now, and I'm sure the Volkswagen is this way, has a thermally managed battery. So there'll be heaters on there and coolers so that it won't suffer the extreme temperatures. Now that does take some extra energy to do that. But if you're leaving it plugged in outside, which you probably will to keep it charged, it'll pull off that power and that will keep the battery warm and be able to then preheat the car itself. So when you get in, you won't have had to use a lot of the battery. So it'll be interesting to see how it survives in the wintertime. I'll be interested to hear a follow-up on that.
Well, and I also like just the novelty of you no longer go to a gas station to fill up and you plug in overnight and your car is full, ready to go the next day. It feels like the future, It's crazy.
It really does, yeah. And it's really interesting because electric vehicles also kind of have backlash against people that are kind of against new technology and, things changing. And my mom, falls into that camp. And so she's asked me a couple times, like, well, so, what do you do when the electricity fails? Because you can't drive to a gas station and fill up your car with gas. And I say, Mom, when the electricity fails, the gas stations don't have electric pumps to pump gas either. So gas cars are not going to be able to get their fill-ups as well. And I said, I have solar panels on my house. And so I can charge at home in solar panels. And it takes a little trick, but you can actually, like when the power goes off, keep your house powered and your car powered through your solar panels. So it definitely is the wave of the future, but people are hesitant about it. And, the charging is one of the things. I love charging home. People ask, how long does it take to charge your car? And I say 7 seconds. And they look at me funny. I said, because that's how long it takes to plug in my car and unplug it when I'm done. How long it takes overnight doesn't really matter because you're just leaving it plugged in all the time. So that, I think, is a great thing. And also, one reason I didn't want to get a hybrid is that I don't like getting smog. I don't like getting tune-ups. I don't like getting oil changes. And the thing about an electric engine is that there's one moving piece in there versus hundreds for a gasoline engine. So it's much more reliable. You hardly need any maintenance at all. You change your tires, change your wiper fluid and wiper blades, and that's almost it for that. And so, yeah, it definitely is a lot less maintenance and just more convenient to own and use.
So being an early adopter, have you taken advantage of, any of the different programs on a state or federal level for rebates or, discounts, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first got the Leaf, there was a special program that would give you the fast charger port. They would give you a EV charger to put in your house and the installation for that. And, that was a couple $1,000 package, maybe even more than that. Of course, there was the $7,500 federal, and I forget what the state was, but they're a different state. So that makes a big difference, and I was able to take advantage of that. Unfortunately, with the Tesla I just bought, it fell in between any of those programs. So I didn't get advantage of any of that. But at that point, I was sold on electric vehicles. And even though the sticker price is higher than a comparable gas car, I just know it's going to last longer and cost a lot less in maintenance and fuel and everything over the life of the car. So it'll still be a good deal, even though the upfront cost is more.
So if you were going to give some advice to somebody who's in the market for a new car and thinking about electric vehicles, what would you tell them?
Yeah, so from a choice standpoint, there's a lot of choices now, which is great. You mentioned you needed kind of an SUV car, and some people need a smaller one. I'm waiting for a convertible EV. I have not seen a convertible yet, but I love convertibles. So one of these days we'll have that. So there's definitely plenty of choices out there. And one of the things to consider is just charging. And unfortunately, the charging infrastructure, even though we've been developing it for years and there's been lots of government programs and stuff to build it out, still there'll be times when it'll be difficult to take long trips and to make sure that you're going to be able to charge during the trip or when you get to your destination. One of the advantages of Tesla is that they run their own charging infrastructure. So when I want to go to Tahoe or down to LA, I just punch it in and it calculates it. It'll show me how many chargers are available. If there's a problem with a charger and it's out of service or they're full, it'll reroute to a different location. So that becomes very easy and worry-free. Unfortunately, outside of that, even though there is a pretty good amount of chargers, the fact that there's not a company that is maintaining them and upkeeping them can be a problem. Because all these people have gotten the government grants and money for installing them, but you have to maintain them. Things can go wrong. Right. I've seen some where people shoot at them and, break the glass and, things can happen, but they're not making money off of doing that. And so that's one of the things that's changing, I think, in some of the new energy bills coming out. It's not just about installing it, it's about maintaining it. But that is a big choice. Teslas do tend to be more expensive than the others. You get a lot of choices, but you do have the advantage of the charging network. With another car, it really depends on where you're going. For years, I had my Leaf that couldn't go more than 70 miles, but I also had a gas car. And that's just what we took on longer trips. So it wasn't a problem. So that is one of the considerations that, if you have another car you can use for longer trips, it makes it much easier because you don't have to worry about it. But if that's going to be your only car, then you need to consider where you're going to go and where you're going to be able to charge.
So, when we were like weighing the pros and cons of an electric car, versus other things, I started thinking about sort of like changes in habits, a little bit. And I'm curious, did getting an EV change the way you think about driving or change your habits, when you were driving?
So one of the things that did change is that when I got an electric motorcycle, so I've ridden bicycles my whole life. I mentioned I had the little scooter, the Vespa style scooter, rode that, and that went like maybe 35 miles an hour. And the funny story with that is I got that when my daughter was like in third, fourth grade, and I used to pick her up to school on it. And I thought she would think that was like the best, the coolest thing ever. She was embarrassed. She'd make me park around the corner. She'd sneak over there when no one's looking, put her helmet on. Okay, Dad, go, go, go. And so, she did not like it that much. Of course, years later, she asked me when she was in college, she was like, Dad, you still have that Vespa? I'd really like to have that now.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, that was fun. And I would take trips, just on that. And then with the electric motorcycle, I mainly bought that because I was commuting up to Redwood City on a very busy section of 101 where traffic was just backed up. And in California, you can split lanes.
Yeah.
So when the traffic is backed up, you can just go and get much more of a consistent time and a fun experience. Later, I started taking the train, and that was even a bigger advantage because on a day that wasn't busy, it would take about 12 minutes to get to the train station. On a day when you had traffic, it would take 30, which meant you always had to leave 30 minutes ahead of time just in case there's traffic. Once I had the electric motorcycle, I knew I could make it there in 15 minutes, whether or not I had traffic. So I was able to save a lot of time because of that, because I just had much more consistent commute time. And I loved riding it. I would take it for rides in the mountains and everything. So it was really nice. I don't have it anymore just because I don't commute anymore. And I'd realized at some point I hadn't ridden it in a few years. So I ended up selling it at that point. But that definitely was just a fun experience. And I never really wanted a gas motorcycle that are loud and hard to maintain and you burn yourself on the muffler and everything. But the electric was just a joy to ride. It was smooth and quiet and you didn't have those considerations. So I definitely did a lot more riding on that than I would have otherwise.
You mentioned maintenance a little bit and the fact that, an EV has like 12 things in the engine compartment. Is it really just tires, maybe some brakes, a couple of fluids?
Interestingly enough, you mentioned regenerative braking. And because of that, most EVs, you rarely use the brakes. So the brakes almost never need replacing on EVs. So that's another thing that's not in there. Tires are an issue. And one of the things about EVs is that they use special tires that have a low rolling resistance and are also quiet. Just because once you take out the engine noise from a gas-powered engine, everything else becomes more apparent. So they had to develop like quieter tires. But one of the things that means is they do tend to wear out sooner than a hard tire on a conventional car. So those do need to be replaced. And I do have wiper fluid. But as far as that goes, I have not done anything else on my car. There hasn't been anything that's really broken down. Of course, things, door handles can break or electric windows, it's got things like that. But yeah, I have not had any service at all besides just those general maintenance of tires and windshield wipers.
That's the thing that's like really astounding to me is, we've got our Honda Pilot. I think it's a 2008. So it's, 15 years old, and it felt like every 6 months or a year, we'd drop a few $1,000s into it. And like, it took me a long time to wrap my head around the fact that like, there are just like, a tenth of as many things that can go wrong in an electric car as in a combustion engine vehicle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked about charging a little bit. What in range are there? Like, what other cons are there? Like, what are the downsides of electric vehicles?
Oh, that's a good question. Hard to think of any offhand. The range anxiety and the range and charging is probably the biggest one because it's just something you have to think about more. Eventually, there'll be enough charging stations and there'll be good software that'll be just like gas stations and it won't be an issue. But right now, you do have to think about that a little bit. For instance, we went up to the High Sierra Music Festival this year in July, and it was in a very small town in the Sierras. And we didn't think there was any electric chargers up there, public at all. So we brought a long extension cord and plugged into the house, and it was slow, but we were there for a long enough period of time. It didn't matter. We were able to charge, but you have to think about things like that. Um, Other than that, it's just hard to think of any downsides. One of the nice things about electric motors is that you can get a lot of torque out of that, a lot of power very easily. So almost all electric, even my Leaf was pretty zippy compared to like I had a Mazda Miata before. It was much faster than that. And I live in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and in order to go anywhere, I need to cross a 4-lane road with traffic going in both ways. So it's a little tricky, and some people at first it's a little scary. But with an electric car, you see a gap, you have time, you step on it, you immediately start going, and you get a lot of pickup, and you can go across, and you just feel like it's no problem. And then I can step on it and merge into traffic. Where with a gas car, like when I was driving my roommate's car, I'd forgotten that when you step on the accelerator of a gas car, it does not go right away. You kind of get this, and then it goes up. And so I was like, oh, crap, cutting that a little bit close. So that's just another advantage of an electric car is you get that smooth, quick torque. So, yeah, besides the charging, it's hard to think of another downside. They are a little bit more expensive to start off with, but battery technology is improving. The range is getting better. Prices are coming down. So that delta is starting to be less and less, and we're starting to see some cars that will be out in the next year or two that'll be on par with pretty much any similar gas car you can get.
That was one of the sort of the big takeaways for us was, we were looking for a larger vehicle and they start at higher price points. And with, so we'll get the federal rebate, which is $7,500. And the state of Minnesota is offering $2,500. And so like if you can take $10,000 off the purchase price of any new car, it's great. But in EV, we were just like ecstatic. And it made the EV more affordable than the other cars we were looking at. So, but I will say, when I think about EVs, like price is always the thing in my head that's sort of the con. But all new cars are expensive, and they got really expensive over the last few years. And, I think the prices will start to come down a little bit. But a new car, regardless of what's powering it, is kind of expensive. So one of the other things I've noticed is that, we are not in the habit yet of plugging our car in every night. We do have a level 2 charger. But we get 270 plus miles of range, and we drive 20 miles a day. And so we'll go a week without plugging it in. At the same time, part of me always wants to like be prepared to like, oh, I may have to drive to my parents' house, 4 hours away, or, have you ever run out of juice on the road, or needed to get a tow in an EV?
Yeah, knock on wood, electric motor, I have not. But I remember there was one time after I'd had my Leaf for a year or two, I hadn't plugged it in, and I had like, I don't know, 25 miles of range. And I wanted to go to Redwood City, which was just about like 23 miles away. And I was pretty sure they had a charger there, but didn't know if it was available. And I remember I was on the road driving, and I was kind of doing the math and going like, oh, this is going to be tight. So what you do in an EV when that happens, you start slowing down. because just the way wind resistance works, when you go slower, you can go further. And so, I went from 70 to 65 and 65 to 60. And eventually, as I got down, I had 2 or 3 miles left, and it was still 2 or 3 miles away. I was going 45 on the freeway. And of course, there's always a little bit of range left. You don't know exactly. But even if you want to go to zero, you have a few miles. But I remember I got there and I realized if I couldn't find a charging station, I wasn't getting home. Luckily, there was a charging station. It was available and I was able to charge. I met some friends, went to the movies, and things were fine. But that was the one time where I remember I was definitely driving much slower on the freeway than normal just to make sure I got it. But yeah, and I take that back. I did run out of electricity in my motorcycle once. But I had a friend come by with my Leaf, which I had hooked an inverter to, so it had a 120 volt outlet. So She came by with that. We plugged in, charged it. We sat and talked for an hour in the car, and I was able to get up and go. So that was one time I did run out, but was able to have a backup plan to keep from being stranded.
You mentioned, you met some friends, went to the movies while your car charged. I think one of the other habit changing things we've started to get used to is going to fill up the car with gas was an errand in and of itself. The car's getting low, you got to go fill it up with gas. But now, there's chargers at Target, there's chargers at Costco, and they're right in front of the store, great parking spot. Charger, even a few of our movie theaters, have chargers, next door or whatever. And just thinking about, if you're worried about range, you can charge over the course of your normal weekend running errands or whatever, because it's not you can put an EV charger almost anywhere because you're also not bearing a giant tank full of gasoline. So it feels like there's going to be more and more chargers available in our lives all over.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to, for part of a summer a few years ago, I was staying at Scotts Valley at a friend's that didn't have a charger there, but the local grocery store did. So every few days I went to the grocery store, I just plugged in and charged. And so, yeah, it just became kind of this habit. And I was also thinking about last time I went to Tahoe, I stopped at this place and charged, and we were looking around oh, what's here? We discovered this fabulous Mexican restaurant, went and had, a nice lunch, came back, the car was charged, and it was ready to go. So, yeah, I think one thing that people do is that instead of we just go to gas station and think, okay, I'm just going to go there and charge and go home or go on, you think oh, I've got to go do an errand, or I've got to stop for lunch anyways, and then that just becomes part of the process. So it's not you're sitting around waiting for 20, 30 minutes to get a fast charge. It's oh, let's do something fun with that and go shopping, get lunch, or explore.
So, I think we're coming up on our time here, but I'm curious, you mentioned wanting an electric convertible, and your first electric car was a conversion. A lot of the YouTube channels I follow and some of the blogs I follow are super big into electric conversions, especially these, older sports cars. Anything with a rear engine, rear wheel drive feels like a good candidate. Would you ever consider getting another converted vehicle?
Absolutely. So when I was in high school, my first car I had was a Triumph Spitfire convertible car. And even when I got it, it was old. And I spent a lot of time in the garage fixing it up. And I remember one time the battery went dead, but I didn't want to buy a new battery. So I just parked on a hill and jump started it, So I'm definitely used to kind of nurturing cars through the various life cycles. So I would love a classic car, maybe an old MG or, think of an old Jaguar. I mean, Jaguar, the engines on there are not very good, but you think get the classic, XJS or something and put an electric motor in there. And as I mentioned with my Volvo, it's not going to be perfect. There'll be some things that aren't as nice as a new gas car, but it'll be a lot better than the original engine in that car, just because the electric part of it will be so much smoother and nicer. So, yeah, I would like to see more of that, especially as people start really moving over to electric vehicles and realizing how much better they are. Instead of just junking these old cars, especially kind of these old classic ones, convert them over to electric. And with battery technology getting smaller and lighter, that becomes a really practical proposition to do that. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to the day where we have a lot of those classic gas cars, instead of spewing out non-smog regulated smoke out the tailpipe, they're all electric and smooth and beautiful on their own right, and have many more years of life.
So if we're looking into the future, say 5 or 10 years, where do you see, the adoption of electric vehicles? What are some of the like trends that are on the horizon that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I read recently that in California, that, and I'm trying to fact check this because now that I'm about to say it, it sounds unreal, but over half of the cars sold were either electric or hybrid. And I might have that percentage wrong. I know I'm saying it sounds like a lot, but the fact is that, in California, we've just kind of accepted that. And people like driving electric cars. A lot of people have them. And so there's going to be more and more of that. We haven't talked about the sustainability aspects of having electricity versus, burning fossil fuels and contributing to climate change. But, one of the things that we really need to do, since cars take about 25% of the fossil fuels, is to convert over our fleet to really reduce climate change and have a more sustainable, cleaner planet. But it's hard because cars, usually people keep them for 9 to 12 years. And now as they get more expensive, it's even more. Yeah. So even if 100% of cars were bought now were electric, it's going to take a while to get all those old gas cars off the road and move completely to electric. So, yeah, I think it's going to be wild, but I think that with examples like California and building out the infrastructure for charging so people don't have this anxiety and feel very comfortable being able to charge at home or on the road, it's going to really speed the adoption. And I think we'll hit a tipping point at some time where people will just go to a dealer and have a gas car, an electric car, and electric car is just a better deal financially, from a operating perspective, from cost and everything, and people will just opt for that. So I do see that coming. It'll be a little while probably before we get there, but I'm hopeful that, in the next 10 to 15 years, that'll come into play, and that, our kids and grandkids won't ever have to drive a gas car, and will marvel at the fact that at one point, Dad, you actually drove something that spit out smoke and was poisonous? How could you do that? So that's the world I'm looking forward to living in.
Each week, we take some time to answer questions from listeners. This week, we hear from Josh, who writes, I need a new car, and I'd like to get an electric one, but I'm a renter and don't have charging available at my apartment. What should I do?
I have this question too.
Have you... So I'm curious about, do you live in like a big apartment building, or do you live in a smaller...
So I live in Chicago. We call them 3 flats. It's a building with 3 apartments in it. Okay. And we have the first floor, and then the basement is my partner's perfumery. So we have a garage, but we don't use it. It's our landlord uses it, who lives next door. So I assume we could work out something with her if we went that direction. That was sort of what I was thinking, but I'm not aware of local charging stations. Again, my neighborhood does not have a whole lot of EV users, so I'm not totally sure. So I don't know. What I would love to hear the answer to this too. What do I do?
So this is something I also thought a lot about. I live in an old house. Getting upgrading our infrastructure to our home with electricity is expensive.
Right.
One of the things that everyone should be aware of is that you can charge your EV on a standard household outlet. If you could run an extension cord to where you park, you are able to charge your EV. It's slow.
Wow, sure, but you can do it. It's a possibility, which is wow. Okay, that's great. Is it less efficient?
I would say it's not necessarily less efficient. It's just slow.
Right. Okay.
A kilowatt costs the same amount of money whether it takes a minute to send it over the transmission line or an hour.
Sure. Right.
It's
Okay.
like the charge is based on like the volume, I guess.
Yeah, we talked like the because if the charger is fit for that, the capacity of how much energy can go through at any time is larger, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I actually did that with our EV when we first got it because we did not have a level 2 charger installed. And I think we could add maybe like 10 or 15, maybe 20 miles like overnight when we plugged it in. But it's like just like a thick power cable that we plugged
Right.
into an outlet outside of our house, ran to the car. In the city, there's always, there's a lot of copper in that cable. So like, there's always the chance that somebody will take the opportunity to grab it if they're walking by. And so like having it plugged into an outlet outside your home.
That would be a problem in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
We get a lot of catalytic converters pulled off cars here, so I would that would be the issue. But again, I guess we have the built-in garage, so I'd probably do it that way, just run a cable out there.
And then also EVs don't have catalytic converters, so another bonus. But so we do have a garage, but it's full of my tools and workshop, and so our cars are parked in the driveway. But when we got our EV charger installed, it's installed in the garage, and we can just run the cable out and like still put the garage door down. And so you still have like the cable outside, but it's connected inside the garage, and it's like locked into your EV when it's in use and charging.
Okay. So I know I've got a friend here who, we're in the city, so there's a couple of free chargers, and I have a friend who lives near Northwestern University, and he would just drive over there, charge for free, which you're probably not really supposed to do. But I'm wondering about that. Is that something people do? Just kind of keep an eye on where the free charging stations are?
Well, yeah. So, I always sort of thought of like filling up my car with gas as like an errand I needed to run, like I'm getting low. I'll go to the gas station and fill up and then go do what else I'm doing. But EV chargers are popping up more and more at, Target. I want to say Jewel has them at some locations in Chicago. They're at Costco now, right up front, close to the doors. I want to say in Texas, maybe, or no, it was in California. Tesla is exploring like building like a diner and drive-in movie theater with like EV chargers.
Oh, that's
and
really
so it's
fun.
like thinking of like, and then a lot of folks, especially who have to like commute for work, will drive their EV to their office building, and very regularly offices have like EV charging available. And so it's like sort of about shifting your mindset a little bit too, of like filling your car with electrons, like can be something that happens when you're at the grocery store or like doing other errands.
This makes a lot of sense to me. I know I've got a friend who we're going to have on at some point who studies EV use in more rural areas, and how he conducts those interviews is at charging stations. He meets people at charging stations and they have a little time. So he's like, let's talk, what's up? But I like that, combining it with something fun. So yeah, like you said, it's just a habit shift, which is honestly a lot of what we do at Home Connect, and a lot of what we talk about, here and on our blog is how do we need to change the way we think about energy usage to modernize everything and to make it cleaner.
And I know like it's like when you're thinking about an EV, you probably have like a little bit of range anxiety, and like the ability to not be able to plug in at home is like maybe something on your mind, but like you also don't have like a gas pump at your house.
That's true. That's so true. I hadn't even considered that. So like you have to go get it either way.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then like even this is something Max mentioned when I talked to him in our interview, is like, what do you do if the power's out? Well, if the power's out at home, yes, you can't charge your EV. Although if you've had it plugged in up until the power went out, you've got battery capacity. But also when the power's out at a gas station, you like the pumps use electronics to pump
Right.
gas. Like you're still also not going to
You
be able
also
to
can't
get
get
gas.
right. So there's all these things that are the same thing. We just are unfamiliar with it. So it feels a little spooky, but we can get over that.
Yeah.
We can learn new things.
And then also in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are incentives for landlords and building owners to install chargers. And so, you know, if you're a renter like Josh is and you're thinking about getting an electric car, you could have a conversation with your building owner or superintendent and just be like, hey, like, let's get some EV chargers here. You know, there's money available. It's going to be a thing that would make a building probably, you know, I don't want to say, or like it would make folks want to rent there more.
It would. No, it'd be more attractive for sure. I think that'd be a smart thing for landlords who are really thinking about doing it for a long time. How do I, how do I be more competitive and attractive in the housing space? And that would be one way to do it, especially if there's money available to make the switch.
Yeah. So like, you know, having had our conversations today and, you know, what are there any other like things you would be worried about having an EV in the city?
You've covered most of them. I mean, ultimately, the biggest barrier in my mind was that jump from not having thought about where to go to thinking about it. So my first step would be mapping out my local charging stations, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing that I can charge it from home really helps that. Though, as I said, in my neighborhood, I really wouldn't feel comfortable running copper. That wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
But I think that would probably be my first step, is just mapping out, okay, where do I go? And like you said, it's just a shift in habit. I already have to go somewhere for gas. And so I just need to identify, well, where do I go for electricity? So yeah, I feel significantly more like I could take this on, and I hope our reader does, or our listener does too.
Great. Well, that's it for this episode of Smart Energy. Thanks to Kelsey for joining me, our guest Max for talking all about EVs, Josh for sending in his question, and of course, all of you for listening. To see the show notes, send feedback, and learn more about Smart Energy, visit homeconnect.com/smartenergy. Stay safe, conserve some energy, and we'll see you next time.